There's a place in the world where time seems to have stopped in 1916, a place where the earth still holds the scent of gunpowder and the wind carries whispers from the past. They call it the Somme. And for millions of young soldiers, this place is more than just a battlefield. It is hell with a name. That year, the world was on fire. World War I had engulfed Europe. Thousands of young men from small villages in England, France and Germany set off in new uniforms, clean faces in the belief that they would be heroes. One of them was named Thomas Williams, a farmer's son from Yorkshire, 19 years old. He volunteered, leaving his mother with a simple promise. "I'll be home before Christmas, Mom." But none of them knew that in the land of France, on the banks of the Somme, there was no way home. When Thomas arrived in northern France, the first smell he caught wasn't fresh earth, but the smell of death. The trenches were more than just defensive holes. They were breathing graves. Mud mixed with blood, rainwater stagnated, touching bodies that hadn't had time to be buried. White bones protruded from the black earth, and in the mist, rats as big as cats scurried around looking for scraps of food and or human flesh. Here, Thomas learned that war wasn't like in the newspapers. There was no honor, no heroes. All there was the stench, the hunger, and the fear that never stopped. His first night in the trenches, he couldn't sleep. The sky lit up every few seconds by artillery explosions. The earth shook. Every time he closed his eyes, the ground seemed to whisper, as if the trench was alive and swallowing everything slowly. Thomas wrote in his notebook that night, "Here the night is never dark. The sky is lit by bombs, and the earth is never silent." The following days felt like one repeating day. They ate little, slept in water, and sometimes dug the same ground where they buried their own friends. One wrong step could mean death, peaking slightly above the trench, and a bullet would pierce the head. The rain kept falling, causing the trench walls to collapse, mixing mud with blood. Flies covered pale, lifeless faces. And with every breath, Thomas knew he was living in a place where life had stopped. One morning, an officer came bearing great news. In a loud voice, he said, "Tomorrow we attack. This will be a battle that changes history." But for the soldiers beneath him, it only meant one thing: more death. July 1, 1916, the day the Battle of the Somme began. And in that one day alone, more than 57,000 British soldiers fell. Most hadn't even had time to fire a single bullet. When the whistle blew, Thomas climbed out of the trench. He ran with hundreds of men through the fog, through the barbed wire, and challenged the machine guns that were waiting on the other side. The world in front of him exploded. The ground shattered. Bodies floated into the air like dolls. Screams turned into whispers, then disappeared among the artillery blasts. Thomas kept running, and without knowing why, until a large explosion hit in front of his feet, and everything went dark. When he regained consciousness, the world around him had become silent. Only the hiss of fire and the smell of gunpowder burned his nose. He turned to his right. His best friend, William, lay still. He turned to his left. There was only an empty helmet filled with wet earth. Thomas tried to stand, but his legs were bleeding. He crawled into a small hole in the ground and hid until nightfall. It was there for the first time that he realized he might never go home. That night, he hid with the two remaining men, Edgar and William. They didn't speak. No words were enough to describe what had just happened. Only silence and a cold that pierced the bones. William stared at the night sky, then whispered softly, "I don't think we're going home, Tom." Thomas didn't answer. He just stared at the ground and hoped morning would never come. And for Thomas, the Somme was no longer a battle, but a place where humans slowly stopped being human. The following days in the Somme trenches were no longer counted by the calendar, but by the number of friends who were still left. Thomas began to lose count between which day or which week it was. Every morning only meant one thing: who would die today. That morning, the sun hadn't even had time to rise when the officers came bearing news. News that was supposed to ignite enthusiasm, but instead caused deep fear. "Tomorrow we will be coming out of the trenches. Charge the German line." The order sounded like a death sentence. Everyone knew that the German front line in the Somme was no ordinary fortress. They had machine guns, barbed wire, and double layers of trenches. And in front of them, only an open expanse of mud that would become a mass grave. The night before the attack, Thomas sat under the gray sky. He stared at the small photo in his hand, a picture of his fiancée, Mary, sent before he left for France. On the back of the photo was written, "You must come home, Tom." He wanted to believe it, but the sound of artillery that night seemed to laugh at that hope. 6:30 a.m., the whistle blew. Thomas and hundreds of his comrades came out of the trenches, their steps heavy, trudging through the wet ground covered in gunpowder mist. Before they had a chance to advance 20 meters, the German machine guns began to sing. Bullets hit young bodies like a metal storm. One by one they fell. Screams, cries, prayers all mixed into one. Thomas fell, his face hitting the mud mixed with blood. He tried to crawl, approaching his friend, Jack, a young man from Liverpool, who always told stories about his mother who owned a bakery. Jack lay with his eyes wide open but no longer seeing anything. A bullet pierced his helmet and part of his head was gone. Thomas wanted to scream, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of war. He just bowed his head, closed Jack's eyes with his hand, then continued crawling forward. He knew that if he stopped, his body would be next. After 2 hours, the attack had completely failed. Hundreds of people died, including almost all of his unit comrades. Thomas managed to return to the trench, his body covered in mud and blood that wasn't just his. He sat silently, not crying, not speaking, just staring at the wet ground beneath him, where other soldiers' shoes were still left behind, buried in the mud, as if trying to get out but failing. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He stared at the pitch-black sky, and for the first time he asked himself, "What is all this for?" There was no answer, only the sound of drizzle on the steel helmet, and the buzzing of flies that began to swarm the dead bodies around him. Days turned into weeks. The Somme trenches no longer contained humans, but shadows. The people there began to lose direction, losing who they were before. Some soldiers talked to themselves. Some laughed in the middle of the night, then fell silent forever with a gun in their hand. Thomas began to write in his notebook, no longer about strategies or reports, but about dreams. Dreams about home, about Mary, about the sound of church bells in his village. Dreams that slowly turned into hallucinations. Because every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jack's face smiling in the mud. On the 49th night, Thomas woke up to the sound of someone calling his name from outside the trench. The voice was soft, like carried by the wind. Tom, come with me." Thomas turned his head. At the end of the trench, in the thin mist, he saw the silhouette of someone standing. His face was vague, but he knew it was Jack. Jack, with a uniform that was still muddy and a helmet tilted on his head. Thomas froze. His rationality faded. He held his rifle tightly, not to shoot, but to calm himself. The silhouette smiled, then turned towards the empty field outside the trench. Without thinking, Thomas stood up and followed. He walked past corpses, past barbed wire, past the stench that he no longer felt. And as the fog began to thin, the silhouette vanished just like that. Only mud remained and something cold on his shoulder, like someone's hand patting gently, then disappearing. Thomas fell to his knees. He didn't know if he was still alive, or had already crossed the boundary between the world of the dead and those who still survived. When the morning sun appeared, his troops found Thomas still outside the trench, sitting silently, his eyes empty. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to eat, and in his hand, he was holding something that shouldn't have been there. Jack's helmet. Even though Jack had been buried 2 weeks ago, the days in the Somme no longer felt like life. For Thomas, time only meant the meaningless transition between day and night. The trench where he sheltered had become a pit of death, its walls full of mud, water flowing mixed with blood and human waste. The stench was so thick it seemed to stick to the skin. One night, Thomas wrote something in his notebook. "I'm still here, but I don't know what for. I hear the voices of people who are no longer alive." He stopped writing when he heard the voice again, softly, calling his name. "Tom!" Thomas turned his head. No one was there, only fog, thick fog that crept slowly into the trench. He walked slowly along the trench. A dim light hung at the end of the guard post. And there was a figure standing with its back to him, soaked with a torn uniform. The figure turned slowly. A pale face, empty eyes, and a wound on the head, right? The same wound as Jack's. Thomas was silent. His voice caught in his throat. He wanted to believe it was a hallucination, but hallucinations don't leave mud tracks on the ground. "Tom." His voice was hoarse but clear. "You promised to come home." "We all promised." Thomas stepped back. His breath caught in his throat. But on the other hand, he also felt something strange. Not fear, but a kind of longing. Longing for a lost friend. He almost stepped forward, but a huge explosion shook the ground. Instantly, the figure disappeared, replaced by a burst of earth and stone. Thomas was thrown backwards, fainting for a moment. And when he regained consciousness, the trench was partially destroyed. Some soldiers came to help, but Thomas just stared blankly. He didn't say anything about what he saw. They were crazy enough to believe their own nightmares. In the following days, Thomas spoke less and less. He wrote more often in the small notebook, as if writing a letter to someone who was gone. He wrote for Jack, for Mary, for himself, who may have died, for himself, who may have died inside a long time ago. Sometimes he talked to himself as if chatting with someone sitting next to him. The sergeant in his unit once caught Thomas laughing in the middle of the night while staring at an empty chair. "Who are you talking to, Tom?" Thomas only answered softly, "With Jack," then smiled. That night it rained very hard. The trench ground began to collapse. Some parts of the wall collapsed, burying the people sleeping inside. Thomas ran to help, digging with his bare hands, but it was too late. 3 people were buried alive, and in the midst of the chaos, Thomas heard that familiar voice again. "Tom, let it be. They are at peace now." He turned quickly. Jack, or something resembling him, stood across the trench. His face was calm, but his eyes were as empty as the sky above them. Thomas cried. He didn't know why. Maybe because of fear. Maybe because of relief to hear the voice of someone he knew. Or maybe because he no longer knew what was real. "Why are you here, Jack?" he asked, trembling. Jack smiled faintly. "Because you haven't kept your promise. You said we would go home together." Thomas closed his eyes. Tears mixed with rainwater on his face. When he opened his eyes again, Jack was gone. All that was left was an old helmet on the ground. A helmet with the initials JR on the inside. The next morning, the British troops ordered a temporary retreat. They had to hold a higher position because the mud flood made some of the trenches unusable. Thomas was evacuated along with some of the survivors. But in the truck that took him away, his eyes kept staring back, towards the fog where Jack had stood last night. He knew that part of him was left there. A week later, Thomas was transferred to a medical post. The doctor said he was suffering from shell shock, an old term for severe war trauma. His body survived, but his mind seemed trapped between 2 worlds. He often stared blankly at the wall, then said softly, "Jack said, I haven't gone home yet." The nurse wrote in her report that Thomas was beginning to hallucinate, hearing the voices of the dead. But no one knew that every night he secretly wrote letters. Letters for Mary, letters for Jack, and one letter for the trench that held him. In one of his letters it was written, "I think I died there. Only my body came back here. Jack is still in that trench waiting for me to come home with him." A few days later, Thomas disappeared from the medical post. No one knew how he got out. But the next morning, patrol troops found footprints heading north, towards the Somme field. The tracks ended at the edge of the old trench, at the place where the first major attack had failed. And there, on the dried mud, was a small notebook. Its pages were open to the last writing. "They are calling me home. I can't leave them alone there. Years have passed since the last gunshot in the Somme ceased. In 1918, the war finally ended. People returned home with bodies half intact and souls that were never the same. But not everyone made it home. Thomas, a young soldier from Devon, England, never returned. When the war ended, Thomas's name was listed as missing in action. Not killed, not captured. Missing. The most painful word for any family. Mary, his fiancée, had waited, year after year. Every time her door was knocked, she always ran with the foolish hope that maybe Thomas was finally home. But there was never any news. Only letters from the ministry full of empty condolences. Until one day, 7 years after the war, a French farmer found something in the Somme field that was beginning to grow grass again. An old rusty helmet, and underneath, a tattered notebook that was almost destroyed by time. The book was sent to the British military archives. There, an officer opened its pages slowly, and among the scribble-filled notes he found the last page. The handwriting was shaky, as if written with a weak hand. The ink was mixed with water, but the sentences were still clearly legible. "I'm still here. Their voices never stop. I promised to bring them home, but it seems they are taking me to their place. If someone finds this, Please tell Mary I didn't mean to leave without saying goodbye. I'm just too far to go home." Below the writing, there was a signature that had almost disappeared. Thomas Ainsworth, 1917. The officer who read the book could only stare for a long time, without saying anything. He closed the book, took a deep breath, then wrote a simple report. Property of soldier Thomas Ainsworth, found in the northern sector of the Somme. No body found. However, a few weeks later, strange stories began to circulate among the field workers who were cleaning up the old trenches. They swore they had seen someone walking in the mist, wearing a complete British uniform with a tilted helmet and an old bag on his back. He didn't turn, didn't speak, just walked slowly towards the west, to the path that once led to England. Some thought it was a hallucination, or just a story to scare children. But every time the fog fell in the Somme, people still swore they heard the sound of heavy shoes in the mud, and the voice of someone whispering softly, "Jack, we're going home." Now, in the place once called Hell's Trench, there is only a vast field with white crosses lined up neatly. Names are written on the stones, thousands, tens of thousands. And among them all, one stone reads, Thomas Ainsworth, lost but never forgotten. Mary finally came there in 1925. She stood for a long time in front of the empty tombstone. It rained softly. She opened a small umbrella, then took something out of her bag, an old photo of the two of them which Thomas had kept in the trench. Mary placed it on the ground, then whispered, "I know you tried to come home, Tom," she cried, but not a cry of despair, but a cry of someone who had finally accepted the reality that some love may never return, because it is trapped in a place where time has stopped. That night, the cemetery guard who was patrolling claimed to have seen something, the silhouette of a young soldier standing at the end of the field, staring at the rows of white crosses. His uniform was tattered, his face was calm, and in his hand added a small book. When the guard turned away for a moment and looked back in that direction, the figure had disappeared. But on the ground right where he stood, there were traces of footsteps, filled with old mud that no one knew where it came from. And so it goes. The story of a soldier who never came home, not because he gave up, but because part of him was left on the battlefield, with the friends who didn't get to go home with him. Thomas Ainsworth never really died, but he also never really lived. He is just one of the millions of souls lost in the mists of the Somme, a place where the sound of gunfire stopped, but their echoes never really disappeared. World War I ended more than 100 years ago, but in every abandoned trench, in every nameless tombstone, there are still stories like Thomas's, young soldiers who are lost, forgotten, and only remembered by the whispers of the fog that won't go away. Some soldiers don't die on the battlefield. They are just left there waiting for someone to call them home. If you like real stories like this, don't forget to click like and subscribe. See the full version in the World War True Story playlist. See you in the next story. Oh.